coma, a family feud, and a legal battle that, like, divided America.
Yeah.
You might vaguely remember the name Terri Schiavo,
Right.
a case that just became, like, this flashpoint for debates about life, death, and personal autonomy.
Absolutely.
Okay, so let's unpack what happened and, like, why it gripped the nation.
You shared a YouTube transcript from Bailey Sarian's Murder, Mystery, and Makeup Monday,
Oh, yeah.
focusing on the Terri Schiavo saga.
Okay.
And I think what's so interesting about this case is it's a deeply personal tragedy that became this huge public spectacle.
Right.
And it touches on so many sensitive, ethical, and legal questions.
Yeah.
Our mission today is to, like, cut through all the noise and understand the core of this incredibly complex and emotionally charged story.
Exactly. And I think, for anyone coming to this story fresh or just needing a reminder,
Right.
back in 1990, a young woman named Terri collapsed really unexpectedly.
Yeah.
She was eventually diagnosed as being in a persistent vegetative state. And what followed was this really protracted and, by all accounts, deeply painful battle between her husband, Michael, and her parents about her end-of-life care.
Absolutely.
And it's just a really stark illustration of how a personal tragedy can become this, like, incredible lightning rod for public controversy. And the lens that we're looking through today is a personal narrative,
Okay.
a true crime storyteller's perspective, which
Right.
I think brings a really interesting angle to it.
Totally.
So let's dive into, like, what your source reveals.
So the video starts by introducing us to Terri and Michael.
Okay.
They met in college back in 1982.
Okay.
And Michael describes being, like, immediately captivated by Terri's laugh and her smile.
Oh.
So, very classic college romance in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
But there's this detail early on. Terri insisted that Michael meet her parents
Oh, wow.
before they even went on their first date.
Really?
Yeah. Her mother, Mary, was described as, very warm, but her father was seen as a little bit more gruff.
Okay, interesting. So right off the bat, there's a little bit of a, like, dynamic there.
Yeah, a little bit of foreshadowing, maybe.
Yeah, and as their relationship developed, Terri shared some pretty significant struggles that she'd experienced, particularly with her weight in high school.
Yeah.
Apparently, she weighed around 250 pounds and felt quite insecure,
Wow.
had been bullied.
Oh.
And the detail that really struck me was her father and brother constantly teasing her about her weight,
Oh, wow.
even offering her money to lose it,
Oh, my gosh.
which, really paints a picture of a challenging family dynamic.
Right from the get-go, yeah.
Yeah, early on.
Yeah.
And that early context, I think, of Terry's relationship with her family definitely becomes relevant as the story unfolds.
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
Yeah. Michael also noted that while Terri, always loved her father, she didn't feel like she could easily communicate with him.
Right.
The old school dad type.
Gotcha.
And interestingly, after only their second date, Terri apparently told her friends that she knew she was going to marry Michael. And they were engaged within 5 months.
Wow, whirlwind.
Yeah, they married in November 1984.
Okay.
So still in college at that point, but decided to focus on working.
Mm-hmm.
Michael managed a fast food restaurant.
Okay.
Terri worked for an insurance company.
Gotcha.
And religion also played a minor initial role.
Right.
Terri was raised Catholic.
Mm-hmm.
Michael's family was Lutheran, but not practicing.
Right.
But they got married in a Catholic church at the request of Terry's family.
Okay.
Michael actually described Terry's family as eclectics,
What does that mean?
mainly attending Mass on holidays.
Okay, gotcha.
And he did notice Terri losing weight leading up to the wedding,
Mm.
but attributed it to, like, typical pre-wedding nerves,
Yeah.
not realizing there might have been a deeper issue.
Right.
Yeah, so after they married, they lived in Pennsylvania for a while. They were looking for a change.
Okay.
Decided to move to Florida, where Terry's family owned property. Coincidentally, Terry's family also decided to move to Florida around the same time after selling their business and retiring.
Oh, wow. So they all end up in Florida.
Yeah, everyone ends up in Florida.
Okay.
And the video really highlights their strong desire to start a family.
Mm.
And Terri was reportedly very excited about the prospect of becoming a mother.
Oh.
But they faced difficulties conceiving, which led Terri to consult a gynecologist.
Okay.
Initial tests came back normal, but Terri still felt like something wasn't right.
Right.
And they were planning to seek a second opinion.
Okay.
Tragically, that opportunity never came.
Oh, no.
February 25th, 1990
Right.
was the day that everything changed.
Yeah.
Michael woke up around 5:30 a.m. to a really loud thud
Oh, my gosh.
and found Terri unresponsive, face down on the floor, partially in the bathroom.
Oh, my God.
He immediately called 911.
Yeah, of course.
The subsequent police report noted no signs of foul play.
Okay.
And when the officers questioned Michael, all he could say was that Terri had been having lady problems and hadn't been feeling well. Right.
Mentioning her recent visit to the gynecologist.
Yeah.
So when Terri arrived at the hospital, she was completely unresponsive.
Okay.
Medical tests didn't reveal any significant traces of drugs or alcohol in her system. However, a CT scan showed a midline shift in her brain,
And that indicates...
which indicates pressure and swelling, often due to like a stroke or similar event.
Okay.
And doctors later informed Michael that Terri had suffered a cardiac arrest as a result of a severe potassium imbalance.
Wow.
So this cardiac arrest led to a lack of oxygen to her brain, causing significant and irreversible brain damage.
Oh my gosh.
And what's particularly striking here is like the medical explanation offered.
Okay.
Doctors came to believe that Terri was likely bulimic.
Okay.
They observed overdeveloped neck muscles, which can be consistent with repeated vomiting.
Right.
And the video makes this really important point, that in the early 1990s, eating disorders weren't as openly discussed or understood as they are today.
So the medical theory was that bulimia could lead to this dangerous loss of essential nutrients, including potassium.
Right.
Which, as we know, is absolutely crucial for proper heart function.
Yeah.
And this severe potassium imbalance could have, like, weakened her blood vessels, significantly affected her heart rhythm, potentially triggering the cardiac arrest and then the subsequent devastating brain damage.
Wow.
It's a relatively rare sequence of events.
Right.
But the video emphasizes that this was like the prevailing medical opinion.
Yeah.
So this event left Terri in what's known as a persistent vegetative state,
Okay.
a condition where the patient has lost higher brain function, resulting in a lack of awareness of themselves and their surroundings.
Right.
Though basic autonomic functions like breathing continue.
Gotcha.
So she was alive, she could breathe on her own, but she had suffered such severe brain damage that she was unable to move, speak, eat, or make any decisions for herself.
Right.
And she required a feeding tube to stay alive.
Okay, so initially Michael was appointed as Terri's legal guardian, and her family was completely supportive.
Right.
Like united in their hope for her recovery.
Yeah.
Michael, especially in those early years, seemed incredibly dedicated to her care, even exploring experimental treatments in California that involved a brain implant
Wow.
aimed at, trying to restore some level of awareness.
Yeah.
But Terri's mother initially refused to relocate to California.
Oh, wow.
And ultimately that treatment proved unsuccessful.
Right.
Which must have been just an absolutely devastating blow for everyone involved.
Yeah, you can only imagine the emotional roller coaster they must have been on.
Absolutely.
And it was after this period of immense emotional strain that I think, like, the first cracks in the family's united front began to appear.
Right.
Leading to this lawsuit against the gynecologist.
Okay, so tell me about that.
In 1992, Michael sued Terri's gynecologist for medical malpractice,
Oh.
arguing that the doctor should have more thoroughly investigated Terri's prolonged absence of menstrual periods,
Okay.
especially in light of the later suspicion of an eating disorder. And he actually won that lawsuit
He did.
and received a significant settlement of around $1 million,
Wow.
with $750,000 specifically designated to be placed in a trust to cover Terri's ongoing medical care.
Okay.
And this is the point where that initial sense of unity really begins to fracture.
Okay, that's so.
Terri's family felt that they deserved to receive a portion of the settlement money.
Oh, wow.
Michael, however, refused, stating very clearly that the money was intended solely for Terri's care and her future needs.
Right.
And this fundamental disagreement really marked the beginning of a major and very public conflict
No.
that would unfortunately last for many years.
Yeah, seems like money just has a way of doing that sometimes.
Yeah, it can really complicate things.
So indeed, following this dispute over the settlement funds, Terri's family initiated their first attempts to legally remove Michael as her guardian.
Okay.
Initially, their claims of neglect were quite vague,
Okay.
and importantly, they were consistently dismissed by the courts.
Right.
The video actually highlights that between 1992 and 1998, Michael was very actively involved in Terri's daily care.
Okay.
He was bathing her, feeding her, consistently advocating for her medical needs.
Wow.
He's, by all accounts, constantly by her side during those years.
So then in 1998, after years of various therapies and medical treatments showed absolutely no signs of improvement, and after multiple doctors confirmed that Terri's brain damage was irreversible and there was no meaningful brain activity whatsoever,
Wow.
Michael made the incredibly difficult decision to have Terri's feeding tube removed.
Oh my gosh.
And it's crucial to remember at this point, 8 long years had passed since her initial collapse.
Yeah.
Terry's family vehemently opposed this decision.
Right.
They clung to any small movement or twitch they observed,
Yeah.
firmly convinced that these were signs of responsiveness and that Terry was still aware.
Okay.
And this decision by Michael really ignited what became a very protracted and emotionally charged legal war that drew in like the entire nation.
Right. And this is precisely where the story truly explodes beyond this private family matter.
Right.
So the courts repeatedly denied the family's numerous attempts to remove Michael as Terry's legal guardian. And it's almost impossible to fully grasp the sheer volume and the intricate complexities of the legal battles that ensued over those years.
Oh, it's a lot.
But one important point that the video raises is that Michael claimed that Terry's family hadn't been particularly involved in her care in the early years.
Okay.
Specifically, when Terry first became ill and was actually living with them,
Right.
he alleged that they offered very little, if any, practical help with her daily needs.
Wow.
He also stated that they never presented any formal care plan to the courts as an alternative to his guardianship.
So the situation took another turn and became even more complicated with the emergence of Michael's relationship with another woman, Jody.
Okay.
When Terry's family became aware of this relationship, they interpreted it as definitive proof of Michael's ulterior motives. Specifically that he was primarily interested in Terry's money and was eager to move on with his life.
Right.
It was around this time that Terry's family decided to take their story public,
Okay.
launching a significant media campaign aimed at preventing the removal of Terry's feeding tube.
Okay.
And this marked the point where this deeply personal family tragedy really transcended those private boundaries and entered, like, the national consciousness.
Right. Right. Absolutely. And at this stage, various religious and political groups, particularly those identifying as right-to-life activists, became very heavily involved in the case.
Right.
They organized protests outside of Michael's home and also at Terry's care facility,
Wow.
often very vocally accusing Michael of intending to murder his wife.
Oh, my God.
And the video actually describes some of these protests as quite aggressive,
Right.
with protesters carrying signs and even making threats.
Yeah, wow.
And the level of government intervention that followed was quite extraordinary and really unprecedented in a case like this. So in 2003, the then governor of Florida, Jeb Bush, intervened by enacting what became known as Terry's Law.
Okay.
And this law actually allowed him to order the reinsertion of Terry's feeding tube,
Wow.
which had been temporarily removed.
Okay.
But this legal maneuver was short-lived.
Okay.
So in 2004, the Supreme Court of the United States ultimately struck down Terry's Law,
Right.
declaring it unconstitutional,
Mm-hmm.
primarily on the grounds of separation of powers.
Okay.
Even Pope John Paul II publicly spoke out against the removal of Terry's feeding tube,
Wow.
really highlighting the international attention and ethical concerns that this case had generated.
Yeah, and the involvement didn't stop at the state level.
No, it did not.
The federal government also became involved in 2005.
Okay.
Congress actually passed a special bill that mandated a federal court review of Terry's case.
Wow.
And President George W. Bush made a point of interrupting his vacation and flying back to Washington, D.C., specifically to sign this bill into law, stating that the government should always err on the side of preserving life. Despite this significant federal intervention, the federal court ultimately ruled against keeping Terry on life support.
Right.
Again, citing constitutional issues and the established rulings of the Florida state courts.
Right.
And throughout this entire period of intense public and legal scrutiny, the video points out how Michael was consistently portrayed in a very negative light by much of the media, often depicted as the villain, while he himself largely remained out of the public eye and avoided media appearances.
Right.
So finally, in March of 2005, after years of relentless legal battles, federal judges ultimately upheld the previous decisions of the Florida state courts, which cleared the way for the removal of Terry's feeding tube. It's almost impossible to truly comprehend the immense emotional toll that those years of constant legal back and forth must have taken on everyone involved.
I can imagine.
On March 18, 2005, the feeding tube was finally removed. Michael, along with his attorney, close friends, and the hospice staff remained by Terry's side during this time. Her family did visit her, but they maintained a significant distance from Michael.
Wow.
And following the removal of the feeding tube, Terry's parents continued to make numerous media statements, steadfastly insisting that Terry wanted to live and that her wishes were not being respected.
Wow.
In contrast, Michael consistently maintained that Terry had shown absolutely no signs of awareness or any indication of her wishes throughout all the years since her collapse.
Right.
Tragically, Terri Schiavo passed away on March 31st, 2005 at the age of 41,
Oh my gosh.
a full 15 years after her initial collapse in 1990.
Wow, what a story.
The results of the subsequent autopsy were definitive and unequivocally supported the earlier medical diagnoses.
Okay.
They revealed profound and irreversible brain damage.
Yeah.
Terry's brain had actually atrophied to about half the size of a normal human brain.
Oh my gosh.
And the autopsy also confirmed that she was completely blind.
Wow.
So these findings definitively confirmed the diagnosis of persistent vegetative state and indicated absolutely no possibility of any recovery.
Wow. So even after Terry's death, the intense conflict unfortunately continued.
It did.
Her family strongly opposed Michael's decision to cremate her remains.
Right?
But ultimately, Michael proceeded with cremation.
Okay.
Separate memorial services were eventually held for Terry's.
So Michael later remarried and has intentionally maintained a very private life in the years since Terry's death.
Okay.
He has publicly voiced his strong support for the importance of medical privacy in end-of-life decision-making, expressing his firm belief that no one else should have had the right to interfere with what he believed were Terry's wishes.
Okay.
Terry's family, on the other hand, went on to found the Terri Schiavo Life and Hope Network, an organization that actively advocates against euthanasia and promotes support for individuals with severe medical conditions and their families.
Right.
They continue to believe that Terry's case carried a significant message about the need to protect human life in all circumstances.
Right.
So this entire tragic saga really brings into sharp focus several crucial takeaways for you to consider. Firstly, and perhaps most importantly, it underscores the absolute necessity for all individuals, regardless of their age or current health status, to have clearly documented living wills and advanced healthcare directives.
Absolutely.
The video even mentions that there was a significant reported increase in the number of people creating or updating their living wills in the immediate aftermath of this highly publicized case.
Wow, that's amazing.
It also throws into stark relief the incredible complexities and the intensely powerful emotions that inevitably surround end-of-life decisions for everyone involved,
Right.
the patient, their family, and their loved ones.
Yeah.
There are rarely any easy answers in these situations, and different individuals will naturally hold deeply conflicting personal, ethical, and religious beliefs about the right course of action.
Absolutely.
And it serves as a really stark warning about the potential dangers of significant public and political interference in what should fundamentally be deeply personal and private medical decisions. You know, the unprecedented level of government involvement at various levels, from the state governor to the state legislature to the state courts, and then all the way up to the federal Congress, like the president and the federal courts,
Right.
was truly remarkable and many would argue deeply problematic.
Absolutely.
From Michael's perspective, as a young husband suddenly thrust into this unimaginable and prolonged crisis.
Right.
The video suggests that he consistently acted in what he believed to be in Terry's best interests and in accordance with what he understood to be her wishes.
Yeah.
Despite this, he faced overwhelmingly negative public perception and was often vilified in the media.
Right.
Even though the source video itself indicates a lack of concrete evidence of any wrongdoing on his part,
Yeah.
which actually led the narrator of the video to a personal shift in her perspective on the case.
Interesting.
The video also touches upon the difficult and often undiscussed reality of the natural death process following the removal of artificial nutrition and hydration, such as a feeding tube.
Right.
It notes the lack of immediate and completely painless options in such situations,
Right.
which was a specific point where the narrator of the video actually found herself agreeing with some of the concerns raised by Terry's family.
Okay. Interesting.
You know, it's certainly a challenging and uncomfortable aspect of end-of-life care to contemplate.
Yeah, absolutely.
And finally, this case so starkly illustrates how deeply fractured family dynamics, particularly when they're compounded by profoundly differing beliefs, values, and desires regarding end-of-life care, can unfortunately make already tragic and heartbreaking situations even more agonizing and drawn out for everyone involved.
Yeah, absolutely. It's just a really, really sad story.
Yeah.
So this deep dive into the Terri Schiavo saga reveals a truly profound tragedy.
Yeah.
One that was deeply layered with complex ethical dilemmas, protracted legal battles, and intense public scrutiny that gripped the nation for years.
Yeah.
It serves as a stark reminder that while medical advancements have given us the ability to prolong life in many circumstances, these advancements also inevitably raise very profound and often uncomfortable questions about the quality of that prolonged life.
Right.
And ultimately, who has the right to decide when and how that life should end.
For you, as someone with an interest in both true crime narratives and the complex world of ethics, this case really offers a unique and unsettling intersection of those two areas.
It does.
It isn't a traditional whodunit in the sense of a criminal investigation,
Right.
but it's a deeply compelling what should be done question.
Yeah.
With absolutely devastating real-world consequences and ultimately no easy or universally agreed-upon answers.
Right.
So considering the definitive autopsy findings, the extensive years of legal wrangling and judicial decisions, and Michael's consistent assertion of Terri's previously expressed wishes,
Yeah.
what does this case ultimately tell us about the fundamental tension between respecting an individual's autonomy
Right.
and the deeply held principle of the sanctity of life? And where, as a society, should we attempt to draw the often blurry line when these two core principles come into direct and seemingly irreconcilable conflict?
That's a great question.
Thank you for bringing this incredibly important and undeniably thought-provoking case to our attention.
Yeah, this was a tough one.
We sincerely hope that this deep dive has provided you with some clarity and a deeper insight into what remains a truly unforgettable and deeply impactful chapter in recent American history.
Yeah, I agree.
Thanks for listening,
Thanks for having me.
and we'll see you in the next deep dive.
That's good.
Bye.